So one of the expressions that I'm new to that I've heard about is called eco-anxiety, which is something I suspect you're quite familiar with. And there was a study done in the UK in 2019, and it was done of 18 and 24-year-olds. And 70% of them surveyed said that they suffered from this anxiety, and they suffered grief and panic and insomnia. So can you tell us what you see with your client base, your patients, and what we can do about it?
Yeah, it's very real, especially for the age group in particular that you named. I think younger people in general, for a lot of different reasons, are feeling more intensity around the psychological impacts of the climate crisis. However, older adults do as well. So what I see in my practice is akin to trauma, akin to a trauma response. So I oftentimes, when I'm working with clients around issues, and we could use sort of the umbrella term of climate-related distress. So under that umbrella is eco-anxiety, climate grief, feelings of immobility, feeling frozen, not sure what to do. I look at that through the lens of a trauma response, an individual trauma response, as well as a collective trauma response. And it's not the same kind of trauma as, a violent physical attack. It's sort of a slow moving trauma.
How does it present?
Yeah, it can present in a few different ways. Oftentimes there's anxiety, there's overwhelm around how to cope with something that partially feels existential and big and unknown, and yet at the same time individually can feel very real and direct. So its expression, climate-related distress, its expression is varied depending on the individual. Sometimes it takes the form of grief, just deep, deep sadness for the species we've lost so far, for the people around the world who are suffering, who are experiencing natural disasters that are directly related to climate crisis.
So these young people are told that they're the last generation, that they have to find the solution. That kind of pressure has to be crushing and daunting. Where do you see the people that talk to you about this? Where do you see them falling in terms of their responsibility to save the planet?
That's a good question. And I don't exactly know the answer, but I think I might be able to link it to like a psychological response. So there's something that's called a window of tolerance that Dr. Dan Siegel, who's a neuroscientist, coined. And it oftentimes is used in the trauma field. So the window of tolerance is basically whatever level of stress we can tolerate and handle and still stay what's called integrated or whole or grounded. And so once someone has jumped out of that window of tolerance, they're now experiencing anxiety, shutdown, denial, rage, depression, overwhelm. And so part of the answer lies for me, mental health wise, is to help my clients get back into their window of tolerance to then be able to have the neuro capacity through the prefrontal cortex to think about what solutions or actions they might take or what responsibilities they might have belonging to a particular generation. So it's oftentimes a complex process that people go through in order to find solutions or answers.
And for those of us of a different generation, we've seen all of this change gradually until lately. And now we are all facing the heat waves and the rising seas and the wildfires and chemical hazards. How do you speak to those of us who maybe are ironically coming to this party late, even though we should have been there all along?
The first thing I'd want to do is just ask them questions about how they're feeling about this climate crisis, asking them what their feelings are in order for them to basically start to what's called attunement, kind of in tune to their internal state or get in touch with what they're feeling or thinking about it. So slowing down the process of basically just considering what emotional state they're in. And oftentimes from that point, we then start to develop a conversation around what the answers are, or what I could do, or what I am experiencing. So it's oftentimes a gray area that's very individual, but I think it does start with someone exploring what they're feeling and me giving them the permission to feel it. Because I think a lot of times, especially with climate discussion, there's a lot of narratives around the should, like you should be feeling despair, you should be working towards hope, you should be taking action, you shouldn't be burying your head in the sand, and so those shoulds are just chucked out, and it's really just, let me hear what's going on for you.
It feels like we're more coming around to the space that we understand this is also a giant social justice issue, that the people that are affected the most day to day, the most critically right now, are people that are of lesser means. Do you have clients in that base? And do you speak to people about the social justice part of climate change?
Yes, I have, and yes, I am. So in 2018, I was living in Berkeley, California, and I was working as a case manager for highly underserved adults. So most of them were homeless. Most of them had chronic mental illness, substance abuse issues, and were not able to get their basic needs met. They were simply surviving. And so those clients that I had when the fires of 2018 hit, especially in November, the particle and the smoke level in the air in the East Bay of California was at dangerous levels for several days straight. And part of the reason why I got into the intersection of mental health and climate crisis is that I felt like I was just sitting on my hands. I didn't have N95 masks to give them to wear. I didn't have resources to provide for my clients to get to a safe place where they could breathe clean air, because those resources weren't available yet. The county and the city were doing the best they could. However, it was back in 2018, from my perspective, a lot of reactivity and learning as we go around how to prepare for a climate-related event that impacts those who are experiencing homelessness, for example. So, I saw firsthand how destructive that is for people who are already severely impacted. And then fast forward to my present day work, and in a private practice setting, working individually with adults, we oftentimes process privilege. We process the privilege of even being able to think about and have a conversation about climate change and the climate crisis, where we're not at the level of just surviving. So therefore, we have the capacity and the privilege to talk about these issues. And it's a lot of times clients come to the realization that because of their privilege, it is an absolute necessity to take action and to continue to increase their own self-care so that their reserves are built up and they have the energy to go back out there and continue to take action in a way that aligns for the greater good, especially those who are more marginalized.
Do we need to do more dramatic things to be in people's faces to say, it's your turn, it's now, it can come just like that, and what are you going to do to help?
Some of the research out there and the experience that from a psychological perspective is actually that's not effective to get louder and stronger and say you need to do more to someone who's maybe showing signs of apathy or denying the fact that this is a big problem. Actually, what's more effective, and again, this comes back to the concept of attunement, or being able to slow down and stay in the present moment, is to actually first kind of get grounded in your own body and notice if you're operating within your window of tolerance, noticing if your nervous system is basically regulated enough to then slowly use what's called motivational interviewing. So motivational interviewing was developed within the public health system, which is what I was working in public health. And it was a way for healthcare providers, especially for those experiencing addiction, really complicated issues, to test out how interested they were in changing. And so what's actually more effective is starting to have conversations with people in the form of questions. So for example, like, I'm wondering if after they've kind of talked to you and given you their opinion and kind of maybe vented, you then say, well, I'm wondering if you'd be interested in me asking a question about what you just said. And you kind of launch from there. So it can be a very difficult process to engage when all we want to do is speed up and solve a problem. And it is a huge problem that is the biggest problem maybe we've ever faced ever. And so the intensity is there. However, the paradox is what actually is more effective is when we slow down, get attuned to what's going on inside of us, and then come from a place of curiosity and wonder that's authentic.
I'm 70 and we keep talking about the planet's going to end or be severely damaged by 2030. And that's only 8 years from now. So what can I do? And what can I impart to my 3 teenage grandchildren to lessen their anxiety, but to roll up all of our sleeves collectively?
The first thing you can do is get really clear on if you feel stuck, if you feel overwhelmed, if you don't know what to do, then let's talk about maybe what you're feeling. And so what's going on sometimes for people is what's called a double bind or a bind, where it's sort of like, damned if I do, damned if I don't, damned if I do recycle. I've heard that doesn't even work anymore, but damned if I don't do anything, because then I feel guilty, because intellectually, cognitively, I know what's happening. But at the same time, I feel kind of immobilized about what I can do to change. And so where therapy comes in is getting into the process of that bind and trying to figure out ways to loosen the bind and then take an action that, might not solve the problem immediately, but also might give you hope or an energy that is similar to moving forward.
In a multi-generational family,
Mhm.
how do we have a meaningful discussion?
I already envision, figuring out a setting. Where are you going to have that conversation? Because also what comes up for me a lot of times with this work is the idea of a container. So the container could be anything. It could be 2 people having a conversation during a protest. It could be a family having a talk around a dining room table, but that there's a sense that we're going to have this conversation and we're here in this moment, so that it begins to create a base of everybody's opinions are valid. I want people to talk about what they're feeling if they're comfortable doing so, and from there, figuring out, well, what action is interesting to you? What kind of sparks your spirit? Or, you processing what your desire might be as an older adult for your grandchildren to do, and then getting into a conversation about that. But I do think it begins with intention.
I can force my family to a dinner table. I can at least do that much, but I'm not sure I can do that so easily with my neighbors or coworkers or people in the community I don't even really know, that I would love to say, we're a small town where I live, a resort community. How would you suggest that we find like-minded people and start those conversations?
Well, I mean, even to go back to the word force, I think there's even a precursor to that. So I really think, and what I talk about a lot with my clients and we process together, is how to come at this without making the other person do something, because right away then there's resistance. And then there's like, nope. And that happens in any context, in a small community. And so really it's an invitation. And it is really, in a way, letting go of expectations and detaching from the pushback. And again, I know that the stakes are so high, and the climate crisis is a long-term destabilizing event that we're all collectively going through. And paradoxically, there's an individual practice of finding a way to hold that destabilization while also trying to stay stabilized yourself. And within that individual trying to stay stabilized is just not trying to force outcomes, trying to invite processing.
How do we get to the conversation about hope when there is so much conversation about end days and gloom and doom and all those rising seas?
Well, yeah, it is deconstructing, and I do this with clients and with myself as well, deconstructing what hope means to each person. And, my own thoughts around hope is hope does not equal optimism. Hope is different than optimism. And I do spend some time talking with clients about that, around what if hope is really doing something because you feel like it's the good thing, the right thing to do. And this is basing off of a lot of Václav Havel, who's a Czech playwright, around his ideas of hope. That, if we take out that everything's going to be okay, and we can hold the dissonance that we truly don't know how bad it's going to get. However, we do know that there's many of us who still want to take action no matter what the outcome might bring.
What is left for us to do on a day-to-day basis, and to set our intentions in such a way that we know climate change is there, we know how heavy that feels. How do we lift ourselves up into each day and just move forward?
Almost all my clients who come say they feel isolated. They say they feel like they don't have anybody they can talk to about what they're feeling and the gravity of what they're thinking. And so one of the big things is I want people to figure out ways to increase connection to other people, finding even one person where it feels safe enough to really vent, or to just really talk about the hard, devastating things that come up with the climate crisis. And also to continue taking care of yourself and not feeling guilty about it. Go for a walk outside in nature. Try to enjoy looking up at the night sky, because all of those things refill us and recharge us, so that we then have the capacity to hold the more devastating issues around the climate crisis.